First off, I'd like to start by thanking the Kandos School of Cultural Adaptation for inviting me to speak to you today, and in particular Lucas, and also a fellow by the name of John Sweet, who made the connection between Lucas and I. I guess I'm slightly different to the speakers we've heard so far today. So yeah, strap yourselves in. The photo is my daughter and myself in a patch of sunflowers on our farm last year, and it was the first time sunflowers had ever been grown in our region. So farmers basically get given by the mother, as we've heard earlier today, 4 things for free: sunshine, rainfall, carbon and nitrogen. And society, whether they know it or not, expects us farmers to manage 4 things, and in order of priority they are air, water, decay and nutrient. And how we as farmers go about managing those 4 things and looking after the 4 things we get for free is what separates the farmers that are long-term sustainable, if you want to use that word, and the rest who are basically degrading our landscape as we go. Can we go to the next slide? Yes. So there's a couple of quotes there for you, both of which you'll find in my Nuffield report. I was very privileged to be awarded a Nuffield Scholarship to study soil biology in 2014. It's an agricultural scholarship that allows farmers to travel the world to seek answers for their particular questions. And I obviously think that plant diversity is one of those keys that I've picked up along the way, and certainly Mother Nature employs plant diversity to maintain soil health. We've probably all seen various slides like this one depicting the carbon cycle. I'd like to more talk about carbon flows in particular. So there's a fellow by the name of Alan Lauder who wrote a book called Carbon Grazing, and in it he refers to what he calls carbon flows, and it more closely resembles what actually happens in nature than this carbon cycle, if you will. Something that science is really wrapped up in is trying to measure carbon sequestration and quantify it somehow. And a lot of that problem that they have is they're measuring, trying to measure the different fractions of carbon and how they impact on or influence plant growth and soil health. But a lot of that is getting down to one particular fraction, which is the humified fraction, which is basically the most stable fraction and the fraction that is most long-lived. However, we're very poor at measuring the very short-term fraction of carbon, which is the root exudates that our last speaker mentioned. And this is perhaps something that we need to get much better at, is quantifying what those root exudates are actually achieving for us, so we can better encourage agriculture to employ what I would like to employ, which is, if we go to the next slide, I think. I'll come to that. So, carbon, the problem. We're very concerned about carbon and carbon emissions, but we've also already talked this morning about the fact that soil can be the solution for that, and governments are concentrating on trying to control emissions, and at this point in time are really struggling to try and address how soil can actually contribute to the reduction of those emissions and the re-sequestering of that carbon back in the soil where it's supposed to be. If we go to the next one. So the solution, and there's a little list for you, and I believe that agriculture, while it's probably the greatest contributor to the problem today is also the greatest potential solution to the problem. And that solution is what's called regenerative agriculture. We'll go to the next slide. And there's the principles that regenerative agriculture stands upon. And they've all basically been touched on already today. So that continuous minimum mechanical soil disturbance is something that conventional agriculture really struggles to get past. Minimum till, no-till systems have been widely adopted within the grains industry, particularly in this country, and have proved highly successful. But in my industry, in sugarcane, not so much. So we've moved to a system that's called green cane harvesting these days, where most of the crop in Queensland is actually harvested green, and most times that trash is retained on the surface. However, during our planting phase, which is every 5 or 6 years, remembering that sugarcane is a perennial grass, so it's only replanted normally on a 5 or so year cycle, in that phase we are very much in tillage. We do a lot of it. So how can I try and mimic what they've achieved in the grains industry, and also try to mimic more what nature does, which is obviously next to no tillage. Permanent organic soil cover. Nature does that very well. Weeds are one of those tools that she uses to try and cover up anywhere that we disturb, and it's vital, as vital as any of the others. Diversification of crop species. So that's the plant diversity. And I guess in my travels I came across this idea of plant diversity time and time again. So for me it became probably the most important thing for my particular situation. Being a sugarcane farmer where we're growing this one monoculture year in, year out, how do I get that plant diversity into my cropping system? And I'll touch on that. Always have a living root in the soil. This is a particular area where agriculture in this country really falls down badly. Now, there's that old thought process, even within the grains industry, that you need to rest land and that you need to save that nutrient and moisture for your next cash crop. So you'll see thousands of hectares sprayed with Roundup as it's waiting for the next rainfall event to plant their crop. So they're actually doing themselves a huge disservice by having that land without roots. They would have been better off leaving the weeds there, most likely. And the last one, the animal impact. That's also one of the ones that I'm really struggling with in my situation, because the animals have been totally removed from sugarcane farms. There's a few that have, particularly cattle around the fringes, but there's not many that actually incorporate animal impact into their system at all. It's something that I'm going to get to as I progress. If we go to the next slide. I really feel strongly about reaching out to a wider audience. So I've conducted a lot of soil health workshops at home, targeting farmers, trying to extend that message of soil health and regenerative agriculture to my constituents, my fellow farmers. And when I got to meet Lucas, I suddenly realised that perhaps through art I could reach a much wider audience and somehow garner change at a faster rate. Because talking to one farmer at a time, it's going to take me too long to make that change happen on the ground. So I have the commitment, and it's my family in this photo that gives me that commitment to want to make that change happen. And hopefully through groups like yourselves, we can all make that change happen much faster. So by commitment, I'm actually talking about the price of food. I really feel that the price of food in this country is way too cheap. It's vastly too cheap. The idea the idea that you can sell a litre of milk for $1 is totally ludicrous, absolutely and utterly ludicrous. The only person or the only group of people that could possibly benefit out of that are multinational corporations, and the people or the thing that's most impacted by that is our environment. There is no money left just for the farmer to feed his family, let alone any sort of return to the environment at those sort of prices. And that goes for most of our food in this country at the moment. McDonald's, KFC, Hungry Jack's, they're probably the worst offenders, but it goes for all of our food in this country. It needs to be more expensive. How we do that, I'm not entirely sure. But we, as a general populace, need to come to the conclusion that basically we need to be prepared to pay more for our food and encourage our farmers to contribute more of that back to preserving their environment in general. We'll go
this
to
is
the
Van Gogh reference, I suppose, in terms of art, is it? Oh, sorry. Sunflowers.
Yes, well, what am I doing to try and, on my farm, to try and adapt these principles and encourage my fellow farmers to adopt what I'm doing? So on the left, you've got what's called a dual crop. So you've got sugarcane in the centre of the photo, recently planted, and sunflowers on either side of it. As a coincidence, sunflowers are highly mycorrhizal. We heard from the last speaker about mycorrhizal fungi. Sunflowers are a particularly good host of mycorrhizal fungi. Sugarcane also hosts it, but nowhere near as well. And because of a monoculture situation, I believe that, well, through soil testing, we've already confirmed that mycorrhizal fungi in sugarcane is particularly low. So I'm trying to encourage, in a natural way, more mycorrhizal fungi, rather than just applying it out of a drum, which you can do these days. But symbiosis is a very important thing, and biology and plants have a symbiotic relationship. And if you apply a product out of a drum to the soil, if you don't have that particular plant species that particular biology happens to like within that landscape, that biology will not survive for very long at all. So you're probably better off providing the environment, so the plant diversity, that'll thereby enable the native ones to re-establish back where you started. So this idea of a dual crop within sugarcane, to my knowledge, this is a first in the world. It's certainly a first in this country. In some of more third world countries, multi-species cropping is still common practice, where everything's done by hand, and they'll have a cash crop, something like sugarcane, and they'll grow other plant species within that area that they're cultivating to eat in particular. So this is like trying to adapt that old principle in a very modern, conventional fashion. So last year I successfully harvested the sunflowers over the top of my plant cane. So it's a plant cane crop. In that plant cane phase, sugarcane, as I mentioned, is perennial grass. It's fairly slow to grow, and the sunflowers, being an annual, are much faster, and they can utilise the sunlight energy that we're given for free at a much faster rate in those first 4 months of the sugarcane growth than the sugarcane can. So instead of that sunlight falling uselessly on the soil, the sunflowers are actually building carbon. And hopefully in some instances, and I did successfully harvest the sunflowers last year over the top of the cane, providing another income stream for our farmers as well. However, there's many learnings that have come with that, and certainly this particular crop I actually knocked down the day before I came down here, so day before yesterday. So it's basically being green manured, as the term is, returned to the soil, because last year I learnt that if I plant the sunflowers in August, it means a January harvest, and it just wasn't practical on a number of fronts to do that in North Queensland during the wet season. The earlier crop last year was planted in May and harvested in October, and proved very successful. So there's a lot of learnings along the way, and I guess hopefully through meetings like this and the spread in the word that we will get more farmers to try this and speed the process. The photograph on the right-hand side is another trial area on my farm, which is a multi-species intercrop trial in ratoons. So the left-hand side is plant cane, first year. Right-hand side is ratoon cane. You can see that taller grass beside me. So it's in its third or fourth year of its cycle there. And I've planted 8 other different species of plant in those 2 rows that are either side of me. So trying to emulate nature, trying to encourage that diversity of soil biology, but it's also enabling better nutrient cycling. It's enabling a whole range of insects, because insects also have symbiotic relationships with plants. So the more different plants you have, the more insects you will have, and that's how nature controls or doesn't allow particular insects to proliferate and overtake everything, basically. So yes, for me it's all about trying to drag agriculture into that regenerative idea thought process, and hopefully today I will have extended that message a little bit further. And at that point in time, you won't have to hold up the last one. I'll finish on that note. Get